If we popularized one thing as an organization, it would be that pastors should be for one another, encourage one another, and connected in little nodes of relationships where you can build one another up, be there in the most painful and difficult times, and also celebrating in the best times. To mourn when people mourn so no one grieves alone, and rejoice, people rejoice so no one cuts a cake alone. And that's for the whole body. But I feel like that could be an invitation for pastors one to another.
Jason, welcome to the Pastorate podcast.
It's good to be here.
I think we can laugh through this moment. A little bit of a role reversal.
Yes.
And we're thrilled to have you on the podcast.
Listeners are used to hearing you introduce the episodes.
That's right.
And me ask questions.
Yeah, you're usually jumping in pretty hot on the microphone.
It would be wholly appropriate if we use someone else to introduce the podcast, you to do the questions, but it's good to be here.
We're glad to have you. I think today's podcast episode a little bit different. Me introducing you or welcoming you to the episode is just us wanting to maybe turn the tables a little bit. One of the things that I've come to appreciate about listening, editing the Pastorate podcast, and our audience has noted when we did our feedback surveys this summer, a common theme was just, man, Jason's really good at asking questions, but we would also like to hear from him. And as we end 2025, and really as we come to the end of 5 years of ministry of the Pastorate, it felt like a pretty organic time to invite you into the guest seat and to flip the script a little bit. Maybe on the front end, you ask good questions. It's something our audience recognizes. Bring us into your world. You're sitting in the hot seat. You're asking a guest questions. What's going through your head?
You know, I'm a preacher. I'm a pastor, preacher. Before I was a pastor, I did a lot of preaching. So I was very used to this idea of like presenting ideas. But when I discovered that I could ask questions and still build content that impacts people's lives, that was really compelling for me. And probably early on when we started the podcast, I had this sense of like, man, I've got to write brilliant questions, listening to other people who I admire who lead conversations like this. But over time, I found myself just discovering that I really love pastors and I'm very interested in their lives. So for me, it's like, I'm so interested. I couldn't run out of questions for a pastor. And because I'm a pastor trying to navigate this in my world, I'm often just sitting here trying to I'm trying to play the part that is authentic for me as a pastor, but representing the pastors who I know are listening and say, we need help. Help us think about this. And we get to interview such wonderful, thoughtful people. And so what's helped me a lot is to, yes, do a little prep, read and listen to the stuff they've been part of, understand their story, but then to almost literally leave that at the door and then just show up in the room and lead with curiosity, but then follow the threads of what's happening. And my favorite moments are where we find ourselves in territory that we didn't expect. And you get a window into people's story or their vulnerability or their wisdom. But it's really, really fun. I'm really honored to do it. And I've learned a lot through it. I think the interesting thing is I find myself, like, how do we grow as pastors? Like, you can read books, obviously through lots of experience, but to be able to talk to people about their context, their learning, their experience, it really is sharpening. So I find myself often on the other end of a conversation going, and I think that helps me know how to pray, or that helps me lead my team, or that helps me think about mission in my city. Or if it doesn't have any sort of practical application, it just encourages my heart. And so what's so fun is when we hear stories of those conversations encouraging a pastor somewhere else in Canada, that makes sense to me because I often find myself walking away going, man, my heart's filled up. I really love that. So it's a joy to do.
Okay, so we know you as podcast host who asks good questions, but bring us into the rest of your world.
Yeah.
We're in Vancouver, and you mentioned like you're a pastor too.
Yeah.
And actually, if I may, I think that's the pastoral curiosity that you mentioned when you're asking questions. You're actually wanting to get better at what you do, and you have wealth of resource who sits across this table often from you. And I think that resonates with our audience. That sense of pastoral curiosity. You're also in it, day-to-day life. Bring us through maybe a bit of the Jason origin story.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a pastor first, so I get to lead the team at the pastorate, but that's a portion of my job. The majority of my work is here in the city of Vancouver, leading a church with some friends called the Way Church. And we planted it 5 years ago. And I always admired pastors, and for a long time wanted to be a pastor. There was a crisis early on of being like, I'm not going to do that. But once I sort of crossed that line, but then what also is also part of my story is I've often found myself meaningfully involved in a local church, and then meaningfully involved with a ministry serving churches. So the most sort of concrete expression of that was, I was a pastor at a church in a city called Langley, called Christian Life Assembly. And I had a variety of pastoral roles, but mostly overseeing preteens, youth, and young adult as part of the pastoral team there. But then I was also meaningfully working for Alpha, building the Alpha Youth Series, the first one and then the second one, and other projects. And that fit me. And it felt like early on in my journey, I felt convicted that I want to serve pastors in the church, but I don't want to do it from the vantage point of like spectator, commentator, theorist. I want to do it as a practitioner. And I found that at times when I was early on, maybe preaching to a room of pastors or answering questions like, how do we reach young people? I could find myself oversimplifying the real dynamics of life in the local church as a pastor. And I think as a result, sometimes maybe putting a burden or saying something inspiring that sound helpful, but wasn't grounded in the actual tensions and realities of life in the local church. And so for me, that's a huge value to not just be a commentator on pastoring, but to do the work. And I do it with a team. So, I'm sure one of the questions that inevitably gets asked, like, how do you manage it all? And we can talk about that if you want. But ultimately, I do it with the team. But for me, one of the biggest joys is doing the whole range of responsibilities of pastoral work. I don't preach every week, but I preach sometimes. We have a team that can support our congregation if there's pastoral needs, but I still want to do hospital visits. I still want to meet with a new believer or somebody on the edge of wanting to walk away from their faith or experiencing pain, and do those one-on-one pastoral meetings. And because it instantly changes the dynamic. Like, one of the liabilities I think for pastoring is like, you can niche into a role sometimes, which is a gift if when you're on a multi-staff team where you play to your giftings. Let's say that you're a gifted preacher and your environment lets you primarily preach. But if you don't do the one-on-one meetings with individuals, you find yourself preaching at like a meme or a caricature of the congregation, not the real thing. But the moment you sit across the table and you hear the questions being asked, the wrestling, the pain, it changes the way you communicate on a Sunday. In the same way, our whole team at the Pastor are people who serve in the local church. All of the leadership team have served as pastors, are still meaningfully involved with their church. Almost all of them expect to leave the pastorate one day to go back to leading the local church,
so
which is something
tough staffing issue for you.
It's a tough staffing issue, but it's a great thing because it forces us to keep saying, let's not just like say pastors should do X, Y, and Z without actually it being anchored in the real realities.
Yeah. No, there's a beautiful ethos in the ministry of the pastorate that I know is picked up not just by the podcast audience, but by people who engage in our cohorts or come out on retreat. Of this is not work divorced from the local church. It is work deeply embedded in the local church. And I mean, it's rooted in your involvement at the Way Church. And you had mentioned it's 5 years old. Tell us a bit of the story of the Way and how you get to 5 years of a church plant journey in Vancouver, still surviving, thriving.
Yeah, we planted during the pandemic, which wasn't the plan. A bunch of us had moved to the city in 2019. and started doing the kinds of things you do before a church launches. Every strategy looks a bit different. Some are more organic, some are more formal. We were somewhere in the middle, but we're doing small groups. We started in Alpha, and then pandemic restrictions hit. And this was parallel to the timeline of launching the Pastorate. And so all of a sudden the pandemic hits, and the two things that this group of friends and collaborators are like, oh, do either of these things work now? But in both cases, it felt like, oh, maybe this was God's timing. Maybe this is why we're doing it now. And the unique thing about planting the Way Church is we planted with a vision to be a church reaching a local city, a local people, but to serve and support other churches. And so there's different expressions of that. Locally, it looks like friendship and partnership with churches and doing some revitalization work of other churches. It looks like raising up leaders through an expression that we call the Way College, but also look like deep partnership with the Pastorate. And so while the two are separate organizations, they came out of the same sort of origin, which was build a local church in the city of Vancouver and then bless the church in Canada, come alongside pastors. And I don't know, I think that church planting in the last 10, 15 years in Canada got a lot of airtime. If you rewind about 10 years ago, my timeline might not be exact. This was like the conversation for late millennials, young Xers, church planting. Tim Keller is writing and commenting on the importance and effectiveness of it. Organizations are emerging in Canada that are doing great training and resourcing them. But one of the questions that began to emerge was, but also what about revitalizing churches? Yeah. Or what about succession? And those are themes that we talk a lot about on the podcast, because while I'm all in for church planting, we also need dynamic young men and women who are young in ministry but have some experience wanting to succeed their pastor or have a heart open to it or be part of revitalizing churches or filling one of the pastoral vacancies. If every leader leaves the church to pioneer a new thing, while we might have some new expression of the church, I don't think it's always a net positive. And so even in my heart, I was like, I definitely wasn't anti-church planting. I thought it was exciting. It's entrepreneurial. That matched my giftings. But I was reluctant because I really believed man, if you could revitalize or be part of a healthy succession in a dynamic local church with a history, that could be a great launching point for serving and supporting other churches. But we really felt like in the discernment journey that the Lord would have us to plant a new church and join in the chorus of wonderful churches in Vancouver and play our part.
Double click on the church revitalization and at least in the Way Church's context.
Yeah.
I know up in North Vancouver, there's been a beautiful partnership that's evolved. Maybe bring us into a bit of that story and put legs on the revitalization conversation.
So I think at its core, church revitalization represents acknowledging that there's life cycles in a church. Not everyone follows the same one, but it's not an uncommon story, at least here in Vancouver, across Canada, that in the 70s or the 50s, this was a vibrant church. A team of people sacrificed, said yes to God, grew, but then there's pastoral transitions, and some churches seem to go from strength to strength to strength, but it's not uncommon over decades for a church to find themselves either in a season of plateau or even attrition that leads to a place where it's like, we don't know how to turn this thing around. And you add really practical dynamics that you might have a shrinking congregation that's aging. There might be no lead pastor or not the resources to get a lead pastor. On top of that, if you have a building, the building is experiencing its own attrition, and you're asking the question, can we even sustain this physical space? And then it becomes a question of stewardship, like how do we best go forward from here? And one of my least favorite expressions of revitalization is the narrative of gone with the old, in with the new. For me, when I think about revitalization, whether it's a church revitalizing by bringing in a new team and a new strategy, or it looks like merger, or even entrusting your resources to an emerging church or an existing church, I still think there's not just the assets of the building, there's a spiritual legacy. There's people that have sacrificed and prayed. And so when I think about revitalization, I think about how do we acknowledge what God has done in and through this place. And sometimes that's even acknowledging moments of brokenness, pain, seasons of not honoring God even. But in that story, I don't know if there's a church in Canada where there wasn't a season where it came out of a desire to make Jesus known, to make disciples. And there's lots of ways for it. So for us, at the core level, we just find ways to serve and support churches and to build relationships. And so at its most basic, it's like not uncommon for we're always trying to train ministers. So we have lots of young preachers who are learning, and we know lots of churches that don't have someone to preach every Sunday. So we send them out, and there's no strings attached. There's no agenda. It's just, hey, if this serves you, we'd love to do that. Inevitably over time though, relationships start to build. And so a couple expressions of partnership that have felt meaningful for us. One instance was we were deeply connected to a particular denomination. One of the guys that planted with came out of that denomination, still has his credentials. And there was a church that needed revitalization. And so we were able to take in for about a year potential church planter from within that denomination, learn and grow and participate meaningfully in our ministry. Yeah. And then we could send him and a team around him to go be part of that revitalization. So that represents a church that's not formally affiliated with the Way, but we celebrate that we got to be part of it. Yeah. And that people from our church were able to go, and we still keep deep relationship there. So that's one picture. Another one is this really unique example in North Vancouver where there's a congregation called Sutherland, church with brethren roots, and some very cool threads of relationship of, like one of the board members or elders was in my grandma and grandpa's small group decades ago. Okay. When my grandparents immigrated from Scotland. So there's these threads of relationship, but they don't know me, but they know my grandma and grandpa, Jer's parents played on their soccer. Like there's all these threads, through the Brethren Church in Vancouver. But we ended up in this relationship with them. It was the pandemic. They had taken on a number of hits as a church in terms of like abrupt pastoral transitions. But here they are in the pandemic without a pastor, a smaller congregation than they've had before, a sense of calling, a story and resources to steward. And through a long journey of like working together and supporting them, we ended up merging, but more accurate, like a marriage. And in humility, they were like, we'd love to become the Way North Vancouver. And as elders and the board, we prayed and discerned. And I mean, this was a year of conversations. So it wasn't done lightly, but we were able to merge. And a few years later, like that's a thriving congregation in North Vancouver. And the vast majority of the people that were part of that church are still in that church. And I see them on Sundays when they look around and maybe there's a baptism happening, or especially when kids are up doing something and they're like, that's always what they wanted, was to see kids ministry full. And you can see them just like wiping away a little tear, looking at each other, being like, this is what we prayed for.
I talked with a gentleman. We had some events in Vancouver this week. And I talked with a gentleman this week from that church community. And he said to me, Jordan, I remember when it was a bunch of us, his words, gray hairs, in that auditorium praying for the sound of children. And he said, and to see the children every Sunday now, I mean, for him, it was, God is so good. And a story like that, for me to be proximate to hear it from his mouth, to hear it reiterated from yours, I mean, that is revitalization.
It's so precious. And it was a lot of humility on their part. And it was about moving at the pace of trust and honest conversations about change, about their values and their story. And we really, really believe we inherited a spiritual legacy, a family of people. And because of the sacrifice of generations there before, we get to continue to steward that space. And our hope is that we will in some way, shape, or form entrust that space and what God's done in that story to someone else. Freely we receive, freely we'll give. Yeah. And so our job in this season is to be as faithful to it as possible. And there's lots of other expressions of revitalization. I think that within denominational structures, there's different support. Sometimes churches can bring in a pastor. I do think the challenge right now, though, is what is the job? Like if you think about the skills necessary to love and care for an aging congregation with certain sensibilities, but also the entrepreneurial instinct to effectively plant within that a new expression that will turn it around. Like that individual, those individuals equipped to do that, it's very rare. It's possible, but it's very rare. And you're navigating so much change and creativity all at the same time. So I do think creative partnerships are one of the ways that can happen.
Yeah.
And I'm hearing that happen all across Canada, like story after story of two groups coming in humility, having loving and sometimes difficult conversation. What could we do together?
Yeah.
And then seeing just like stunning results. And I think it's an important piece of the puzzle in the church in Canada right now. And there's lots of reasons for it, including the shortage of pastors that we're facing, where it's like there isn't a surplus of trained, equipped, called, healthy ministers. And so maybe in this season, collaboration is one of the ways that we can steward the congregations that God scattered across the church in Canada, but also raise up ministers from within. So I think creative partnership is a key to revitalizations.
5 years into the journey of the Way Church, also marking 5 years into the journey of the Pastorate. And, you just mentioned some of the stark realities of the pastoral landscape in Canada over the course of the last 5 years. A shortage of trained, equipped ministers who are ready to jump into some of these very unique challenges set before them. What have you observed change in the pastoral landscape across Canada over the course of the last 5 years? What conversation are we having now that's maybe different than, the throes of the pandemic?
Yeah. A couple thoughts. I think that the conversation is less about technique than it was 5-10 years ago. How do we do this? And more about what kind of person am I called to be in the Lord to faithfully serve the church and build the church in the future? How do I have a deep life with God? How do I get clear on my calling? How do I courageously champion the word of God and go in the power of the Spirit? So I think there's still great conversations around strategy and technique, but there was a window where even in the pandemic, it's like, how do we do church online? And I like thinking strategy. Like I love going there, and it's like, okay, can we use this tool and this technology, and this is how we'll do it. And there's conversations about, the church will never be the same. And in some ways that's true, but we're asking the question, like, what will be the reality of like the post-pandemic? Is everything going to be online? But here we are, a number of years later, and the core call of the pastor is the same. And the thing that causes the church to thrive in a place is courage to go in the way of Jesus, courage to invite people into the life of Jesus expressed through the Word of God, dependency on the Holy Spirit, a culture of prayer. So I've seen the conversation amongst particularly younger ministers move from this technique and strategy and to, while there's still thoughtfulness about that, what kind of person can I become to lead well? And what kind of teams and environments can we create? I think that also, I wasn't sure, like we have the shortage of pastors, but Daryl was with us last night, Daryl Johnson, who's a regular fixture on the podcast here. And, he's been doing ministry for over 50 years in the local church. And what he says again and again is, while there is a shortage, his observation and optimism about young ministers is very high. Mm-hmm. And I feel that, like in our emerging leaders lab, when I look around the room, I'm like, these are Gen Z pastors. I'm a millennial. I'm old now. I'm like, they're more serious about Jesus. Mm-hmm. They're more hungry for an authentic move of God. They've got all their own unique challenges, some similar to every other generation, some unique to theirs. But there's a real hunger for the real thing. There's a counting of the cost. I don't think anyone thinks it's a cool job.
Right.
Or I think there's an acknowledgement of like, this is a countercultural vision that I'm meant to give my life to, and I want to count the costs for the sake of others. So that's very encouraging. I don't know if that's a change, but it's an observation for me. Like, there's this hunger for the real thing.
Yeah.
And I know that's echoed across all generations, but there can be this narrative that maybe we can help curb of like, oh, those young whippersnappers,
Right.
they're just shallow and da-da-da-da. We have our issues, but it's like what we're seeing is just some real beauty, some real thoughtfulness, real pursuit of character, aware of all the unique challenges of pastoring in the digital age, but like a real desire to be men and women of character. So that's really encouraging. And I do think that another thread we're seeing in the church is a breakdown of denominationalism. Now, I think that denominations are something that are a powerful force in our country.
Yeah.
And I pray for the renewal within denominations. There's incredible denominations doing great things in Canada. But what I mean by like a post-denominationalism is that individuals don't find their identity as much in their denominational tribe, as much in finding brothers and sisters with shared values, sometimes within their region, sometimes more broadly speaking. And so there's an interesting shift happening here where I think there's a great opportunity for denominations to continue to serve and gather their people, less around just theological distinctions, though those are important, but also around shared values and shared mission. But there's a hunger for a relationality with other ministers, which transcends like, I'm part of this stream or this is our polity, but more around I'm looking for people who I can be in knowing relationships with and have shared values with and run with.
Yeah, we often talk about in environments where we gather pastors, there's just something about being in the room with another pastor who sees you.
Yeah.
Just a space to be known. And
Yeah.
and you don't have to say almost anything. I think it's the pastoral, as you've framed it,
Yeah.
they do know,
They
they
get it.
do get it. And I think, that's probably cross professions too. You jump in the same room as a bunch of teachers and they get it. They have the same struggles. But in the Canadian pastoral landscape, we bring pastors together and there is a unique carrying and sharing of burdens that happens, a unique knowing and being known, a unique encouragement for the future, and a camaraderie, a co-labor. We are in this together for the cause of Christ and for the good of his church and for the good of that church as it serves the nation of Canada. And so, that gets me excited.
Yeah.
And I think it plays into every element of what we do at the pastorate. So, we often think of our ministry in a couple buckets.
Yeah.
We have our podcast or content in general, digital resources and being able to talk to the person who's jogging right now, wherever they are in Canada. And then we talk about gathering pastors and the importance of that embodied incarnational ministry. We are in the flesh together, whether that's for one day in Eastern Canada and we all get together for a couple of hours and just enjoy each other's company and worship the Lord and pray for one another, or whether that's for a little bit longer on retreat where we say, hey, let's give a week. And then we talk, just like you've mentioned, about these pastoral formation cohorts, longer commitments, 12 months, 14 months. We're in it together in the throes of relationship, cross-denominationally, cross-expressions, and we're doing the thing and carrying each other's burdens through it. Out of the ministry that the pastorate does, you don't have to rank them, but what gets you excited? Like, what are you seeing now in the ministry of the pastorate that you go, oh, like 5 years ago, this was a dream.
Yeah.
And now this is happening right before my eyes.
I think what's most encouraging, oh man, that's tough. I'll tell you two things that are very encouraging. There's an ecosystem between these experiences. So, we shared a story at one of our gatherings recently of pastors in Ottawa, Caleb and Alex, who are at local church. And the pastor that preceded them was a friend of mine called Levi. Him and his wife, Nadia, planted local church. When the pandemic hit and we just started the pastorate, we were trying to, okay, how do we serve pastors? So one of the things I did is I started a little monthly meetup on Zoom with Brandon and Ben and Levi and myself. I never met Levi before, but I, for some reason, was like, I should invite him into this. I just heard of him. And he said yes. And so then that was like one of the first pastor kind of small group expressions we ever had. So over time, there's a relationship built there. There's a regular cadence. And when he and his wife feel called to move back to New Zealand and plant a church there, they entrust this church to this couple, Caleb and Alex, but they say to them, you should go to one of these pastorate retreats. And so you have some people to run with. And so I meet them for the first time there at one of our retreats out here on the West Coast. And then from there, they find themselves plugged into one of our programs. There's deepening relationship. But even though that program has ended after, 15 months or so connected, they're still connected, able to tap into the podcast. I'm still regularly connecting with them. More importantly than him connecting with us, the friendships that they've made through that, they continue to go on. I'm like in some of the group messages that they're in with other pastors, and this is active encouragement. And so for me, it's less about one of the singular programs, but how there's sort of this environment of connectivity with other pastors. There's different wells that people can draw from at different times and various levels of depth. Because while I think that the most impactful thing we do are these long form cohorts, because when you spend 15 months in a committed group of people and you really get to know each other and you go through life's pains and sufferings and challenges in the church, and there's trust and camaraderie and learning and growing together in ministry, there's nothing like that. That's not necessarily the right thing for every person in every season.
Right. But
the fact that you can grab an episode, hear a story of a pastor in a city nearby or city far away, and feel connected into that, one might be more transforming, they're both deeply important because it makes accessibility broadly. And I think for us, we're just trying to create different wells that pastors can draw from to find nourishment, encouragement, and ultimately, our old name was the Canadian Church Leaders Network, and I'm so glad we changed it to the Pastorate. But the reason why we used the word network was because in the most real way, we didn't want to create a formal network. It wasn't top down. It wasn't like a denomination. We wanted to complement denominations, not an alternative to denominations. And it wasn't a network like other networks that people know of, like Acts 29 or things like that, where you'd be like, I'm an Acts 29 church, or I'm an Acts 29 planter. When we use the word network, we meant it in the most organic sense of it. All these different synapses of relationships that grow over time. And I think that humans are wired to be in networks of relationships with various degrees of commitment and relationality, little nodes and hubs that all connect together. And for us, we wanted to create a network of pastors that was truly national, multi-denominational, diverse in expression, but could rally around a couple shared values of being for one another, having a hope-filled vision of the future, centered on Christ and His Word, all those things. And I still feel like, though we have, I think, a much better name, I do feel like, in a sense, what we're trying to create is a shared culture and a growing community. And what encourages me the most is we might go into a city and do a pastoral meetup, but then what ends up inevitably happening is relationships are built, and there are expressions that look like the pastorate and carry the values, but are not under our leadership.
Yeah.
That are happening where, as pastors, I know that you probably know a few of the guys from one of the emerging leaders labs that still meet up on a regular basis.
Yeah.
And there's a number of groups like that. So I think we get to create these containers, but to see them kind of the ripple out effects, and people go, oh, I don't need to opt into a formal program to still meet regularly with other pastors or to be a voice of encouragement or champion these values. So that's been very encouraging.
Yeah, even to tease some of what we're putting our hand to right now at the Pastorate and what we want to release next year is just real concrete help for pastors who say, you know what, I'm not ready for a 12-month commitment of Zoom calls and retreats and whatever else.
I can't travel. I can't make those commitments because I'm bivocational or season
I'm a
wife
parent.
family. Yeah, exactly.
Exactly. And for us to be able to put together some of our best practices and be able to release that for, not just the podcast audience, but anyone who finds themselves in the ecosystem that is the Pastorate. Those are things that excite me. A
couple of thoughts on that, because I think that's what helped me in my story is early on. There was this group of pastors that I had some friendships with, and they were meeting every year. They'd do a 3-day retreat together, and it preceded me. I think a few of them, some people remember Eugene Peterson towards the end of his life. When he would correspond with pastors, he'd invite them to come and visit him in his cabin in Montana. I think I'm getting that right. And so a few of these pastors ended up visiting Eugene Peterson at the same time. And it was so life-giving, and they kind of resolved together, we should do this again. And I think they got to see Eugene one more time, but then that wasn't available. They're like, well, maybe we could just do this. So they started getting together once a year, group of 5 or 6 or 7 pastors. And the format was really simple. They'd spend a couple days together. They would pray for one another. They would share honestly. The vision was less burnout, less scandal, more faithfulness, more courage. That was the vision. And they believed it was through knowing one another and being not just accountable, but open, receiving care, honest about their humanity, honest about what they feel God calling them to. And most of the time was just them as peers, but then they'd sometimes zoom in or bring in a sage, like, Eugene wasn't available. So they say, well, maybe we can invite so-and-so, or one of them had a relationship with an older pastor in their life. Well, we'll bring him or her in, and we'll ask questions and learn from them. And then I kind of got smuggled into that group late. I never got to meet Eugene, which I would have loved to, but I got smuggled in that group late. But I experienced something very profound, which was I'm in a room with people running this race, different cities, different challenges, but there's something so deeply empowering and healing. Like, it gave courage and comfort. I remember one time sharing like fears about standing on certain Christian truths and how will people react to that? And just knowing that these other ministers were like, we're standing on the same ground with you. I'm like, okay, that's enough. And I used to come back from those, we still do it annually, coming back from those going, that was better than any conference I could go to. That was better than any guided retreat. It gave me comfort. I'm not alone, and courage to keep going.
Yeah.
And in some ways, that's what we're trying to reproduce in our environments to varying different degrees. But it's also something that anyone can do.
Yeah.
But what's interesting, like, you don't need a formal setup for it. But if that helps you opt into it, that's why we make them available. But what's interesting is a lot of these things can start, but maybe the first time you meet up, maybe you do a monthly, not an annual or whatever it is, it feels like exciting and easy. Every single year, it's like a battle to get down there and get together, because life is so busy. And it's very easy to say, do I really have time to spend 3 days with this group of pastors? Or do I really have time to jump on Zoom again for this monthly meetup? And honestly, once the honeymoon stage of it's done, it feels like discipline. Sometimes the first thing you want to do in the morning is pray. But most days it feels like a quiet resolve that I've determined that I must do this.
Yeah.
Not out of guilt, not out of religious duty, but I know that my soul and my health is dependent on tethering myself to God in my first moments of the morning. And I think that pastors connecting with other pastors in a way that's not just about sharing ministry stats, but is actually about caring for one another, comforting one another, and then imparting courage and support to one another is that essential. And if you begin to gather together, and you were saying, like, we're going to build a little guide that we'll release in the next year that could help people do peer-led groups like this and different models for it. It's still going to have to go past like this is fun and exciting.
Right.
I know there's a few extroverts out there that just getting together sounds electric, but the majority of pastors, your schedule and your time won't allow for it. But if we popularized one thing as an organization, it would be that pastors should be for one another, encourage one another, and connected in little nodes of relationships where you can build one another up, be there in the most painful and difficult times, and also celebrating in the best times. Like, when we have a tough moment in our church, there's a few pastors I want to text and just say, this is what's happening. They don't need all the details because they get it.
Yeah.
And all they have to write back is like, that sucks, dude.
Oh, I feel that.
And it instantly helps. But the same when there's a win.
Yeah.
Like, if something happens, and like, I know we're not supposed to say like share our baptism number or our giving numbers, but if there is like whether it's 30 people got baptized or 2, they know why that's important and why that's exciting. And I want to be able to say, guys, this happened. And they go, way to go. That's awesome.
At a moment this week, I was texting some pastors that I had been in a cohort with. And it was that same time in the pandemic. And it was one of your team members who had started a cohort for executive pastors across the country. And we were the West Coast, the East Coast, and the prairies meeting on Zoom regularly throughout the pandemic. And I recall a remarkably, probably the most painful but formative, and in retrospect, I'm so grateful to the Lord for what he brought me through. But I remember just painful season. And I was chatting with some of these pastors from that cohort this week, just individually on text. And I was brought back to, it was actually seeing like the little iPhone face. And I saw his face, this pastor on the East Coast. And I was brought back to the Tim Hortons parking lot where I was crying in the front seat because the world was crushing in on me in ministry specifically. And I didn't, and the dude just prayed for me.
Wow.
He hadn't navigated it.
Yeah.
He didn't know best practice. I think he sent me a policy doc or two. But he prayed for me. I remember the Tim Hortons and just seeing his face brought that back to life for me.
Yeah.
It's a remarkable thing. The body of Christ. It's a remarkable thing, pastors, I said it before, bearing each other's burdens.
Yeah. And it's okay to be at a place where like, I know God's called me. I know he'll give me the strength, but we're not meant to do this alone. God designed the body of Christ in such a way, not that we're codependent. We're ultimately dependent on God, but we're interdependent. We're relational beings who are meant to find nourishment and care. And some of God's grace in our life is distributed through relationships. And I'm so thrilled that this is a moment in the church where there is a lot less dividing walls between ministers, with a lot less comparison. But some of that is still out there, and we can just wrap that up. Like we could just decide as a church in Canada, we're not doing comparison. We're not letting ego get in the way. We're not trying to be on, we're one team. We're not trying to be on the winning team within Jesus's church. We're acknowledging that this is his church.
Yeah.
And if the average pastor in Canada was for a few other pastors in their city, sending the odd note of encouragement, you run into them at Costco, it's like, it's so good to see you. I love what you're doing. I'm so grateful that you said yes to serving God in the city. If that began to be the contagious environment, man, we're on to something. And then all the possible collaboration and partnership that's on the other side of friendship might happen. But that's not the end goal, is that we all do one joint service in a city. That's not an inspiring vision. The inspiring vision is that in the diversity of all the expressions, there's this sense of the Spirit of God at work within this network of pastors and ministers to do something bigger than we could ever imagine. Yeah. It means you do carry a bit more burden. Like it means you're kind of carrying some of the suffering of other pastors. Yeah. But it means you're also carrying a lot more celebration. Yeah. Because you get to share in the wins, like I was part of that. And I think about, I don't know if it's Romans, rejoice with those that rejoice and mourn with those that mourn. And that's a call to the body of Christ. I think it's Paul saying he's unpacking like worshiping God with your whole life. And one of the ways we do that within the family of God is to mourn when people mourn, so no one grieves alone, and rejoice, people rejoice, so no one cuts a cake alone. And that's for the whole body. But I feel like that could be an invitation for pastors one to another.
Let it be so.
Rejoice with those who rejoice, mourn with those who mourn.
Yeah, let it be so. Bring us into the next 5 years of the pastorate, if we can think that far ahead. Yeah. Maybe the next year. It's been 5 years behind us, but you've articulated a beautiful vision of pastors supporting pastors. And I think there's a deep resonance with pastors across the country who are realizing that I do need brothers and sisters to walk with me through it. What do you imagine for the ministry of the pastorate as we walk into the next year, the next 3 years, the next 5 years?
Yeah. I think our mission is crystal clear. It's clearer than it ever has been. We're for pastors. Yeah. We're for the church. We're for Canada. Even when we rebranded from CCLN to the pastorate, it was going all in, like we're for pastors. And that was really important even for the podcast, because I really enjoy a lot of leadership podcasts, a lot of entrepreneurial podcasts, or even within Christianity, there's pastor-ish podcasts, but it's the broader Christian leadership conversation. And I benefit from those. But we realize that there's something very unique about the pastoral calling and unique about Canada as a place. And so we wanted to zero in on strengthening pastors for the renewal of the church in Canada. And so the vision is transformation of society, but like the strategy is like strengthen pastors, strengthen pastors, strengthen pastors. And as we think about the next 5 years, we want to grow in depth of quality in our work. And so we cherish the opportunity to tell stories for the podcast. And we want to do that with more care and thoughtfulness, reach further into some of the best stories of God at work in Canada, none of us have heard about.
Yeah, that's right.
So we want to like dig deeper, like find those stories. And honestly, what's been really fun is the network of listeners have been like, do you know about what's going on here? Do you know this guy or girl who's leading church in this particular place? Like, love that. We want to continue to gather. I think early on, like we started the pandemic, gathering wasn't much of an option. And then slowly as restrictions opened up, and we've just realized as much as the podcast really does make a difference, there's nothing like being in the room together. And so we really enjoy doing city meetups. We're going to continue to do them. It's a way for us to sort of like pull people together relationally. And then we want to meet people who are part of this community of listeners. And so this last year we were in Ontario, in Edmonton, in Alberta, in Winnipeg, and in Vancouver. And as we look at next year and the years that follow, we just want to like add a few different plot points to there. And then we want to make those gatherings worthwhile in such a way that if somebody drove out to it, stayed a night nearby because it's a real commute, that would feel worthwhile. So trying to think, how can we deepen those experiences so we can experience the joy of being together, to take something of what's experienced here in the room. As we want to add more retreats. We've been doing these retreats and we've been doing them in partnership with this amazing retreat center called Barnabas. And more healing and ministry and new vision comes out of those than we ever thought for. Yeah. And like, we don't do a lot of these things. Like we set the table, there's good food, there's good hospitality. There's a few sessions, but less than people expect. And something happens. And so I think it is like we create an environment that's not so over-programmed that it feels just like more work, but it's intentionally allowing people to enter into not just rest, but encounter with God through people, through space, through some quietness and some play. Yeah. So we want to continue to do those. And what's really fun now is we have these two main sort of long form pastoral cohorts, one called the Emerging Leaders Lab, one called Lead Pastors Fellowship. And we start our next round of Lead Pastors Fellowship in the new year. And then a few months later, the new round of the Emerging Leaders Lab. And so on like every year, there's this cycle of more room. And so we get to see the alumni base grow of people who graduated from it, who have these different levels of relationship and all that, but new people welcomed in every year. Yeah. And what's been really fun is seeing people who we met at a conference or a meetup and they were just graduating from Bible college. 2 years later, now they're serving in church, the Emerging Leaders Lab. 2 years later, they've just been tapped on the shoulder to take this other role. So like seeing how those relationships grow, probably besides just creating more access points for people and trying to do our work with more care and consideration. I think like we mentioned, we want to create resources that help people create environments like this on their own. Yeah. We want to continue to coach pastors in the one-on-one setting. And then we're dreaming about a national gathering and, for lack of other words, like a conference, but more than just sessions, but a real gathering that can be deeply equipping, deeply formative, can be a celebration of what God's doing in Canada, can bring awareness to opportunities for us to respond as the church in Canada. And it's hard in Canada to do a national gathering because if you are almost in anywhere but the host city, you could get to Miami or LA or London, England at the same price
That's right.
as you could get to whatever city. And so what our hope would be is that we could create an environment that not only feels worthwhile, but that there would be a joint vision for pastors and their teams. We'd love it to not just serve like lead pastors, but lead pastors and their whole team. So like this could be an equipping experience, but also a rallying point for a diverse representation of the church in Canada. So we're dreaming about that. Probably some point this next year, we'll be able to share a bit more.
Yeah.
But we don't really see ourselves wanting to get infinitely bigger. We've talked about, could we make more room in our programs? Like, could we launch more cohorts? I think what mostly excites us would be to do what we do with more excellence and thoughtfulness and care.
Yeah.
And then to support other organizations, could be denominations, could be other parachurches, even churches that want to get behind this, and share whatever we've learned and say, what would it look like for you to create expressions like this? Because the recipe is pretty simple. For the church, for Canada, for pastors, gather in a low ego environment, share what we've learned. So there's some craft development, but more about character and heart.
Yeah.
And I think that we're seeing that. We're seeing more and more things like this emerge. And that's not a threat. That makes us feel like we're succeeding.
Yeah.
Is like, could we spark more expressions of this? What else is really fun is other countries. Like, we get, when are you guys going to do this in our country? Well, we're not. We're all in for Canada.
It's in the Instagram DMs
we're
every day.
Every day.
Yeah.
But it's been really special to, and I've had the opportunity to do this with a couple pastors from around the world, say, if you were interested in doing something in your country, here's everything we've got.
Yeah.
And any way we can help. So that's really fun.
I've had a couple of those, both in the States, a gentleman who listens to the podcast from Germany.
Yeah.
And just handing over everything we do with the Emerging Leaders Lab and say, dude, take it and run.
Yeah.
And bless the church in Germany.
Yeah.
And bless the church in the Netherlands. And bless the church in wherever you're listening from.
I think it's been really fun for us, I know, like as a team, to be all in for Canada, because our listener base, do you know the stats? Like, how many non-Canadian, like what's the percentage of people outside of Canada that listen?
Yeah, I would say we're probably like maybe 35% of the audience might come from outside Canada. So it's relatively high audience for a Canadian podcast.
And what I think is interesting is like, there, you know, we've had, you know, like you know, somebody on the board or somebody be like, hey, should we consider, you know, and then really quickly, there's always deep unity, like we're for Canada. But I think one of the reasons why it serves people outside of Canada is because we're having a conversation that's informed by a place. Yeah, and good ministry is always taking the unchanging realities of the gospel and making it accessible for the very present realities of the people. And I think that Canada has something to give the nations, to give the global church. We also can learn from the global church, but it's exciting that we get to be we feel like we're brokers of these stories, that if they can serve and bless anyone else or spark creativity, that's really exciting. But that won't change. We're all in for the church in Canada. And we feel really honored to share her story through this forum and lots of other ways.
That's a good note. What we'll do in this episode, in the show notes, we'll include actually a couple stories that we've told this year, just a couple links to videos that our team produced, where our audience here could dive into some of the work of the pastorate and its ministry in the lives of pastors from across Canada. Both Caleb and Alex, who you had talked about earlier today, and another pastor from Edmonton named Aaron. And we'll make sure that those are in the show notes. Cool. And take time after you listen to this episode to jump into the show notes, because it will be well worth your time to hear of real pastor stories from across Canada and what God's doing in their lives. Jason, I turn to you for the final word. If you were to address the Canadian pastoral landscape or the pastorate's listeners from coast to coast, what do you leave them with?
I just think it's a really precious thing we get to do. I think pastoring's a very difficult job. And I hope that people find comfort when they listen to this podcast. Be like, oh, someone knows the challenges. Not that we all need to feel bad for ourselves, but it's just nice to know that there's other people that get it. But it's a very precious calling to be able to share the words of the one we love so much with others. To be able to witness up front people going from the kingdom of darkness to the kingdom of light. And this sounds so basic, but I'd want to say that God is real. his kingdom is at hand. That Jesus did defeat Satan, death, and sin. And he decided in his wisdom to call a people to himself called the church. And the gates of hell would not be able to prevail against it. And we get to be part of that. And that's both comforting and encouraging. And in the midst of the flurry of all the stuff we hear and feel and see in a given day on the news and our social media thread, as we walk through the cities and towns that we're called, it can feel like the only thing that's real is the problems right in front of us. But when you pause and consider that the kingdom of God is at hand and this is our Father's world, and that Jesus is coming again, and as we anticipate his coming, whether we see revival, which maybe we'll see something like that in our time. I think there's definitely a real move of God. Regardless of that, would we be found faithful to say, God, with what you've entrusted me in this place, I will give you an offering of praise. Our church, big or small, will gather and give you worship in the city. And I want to be part of being found faithful to him. And I know that people listening, that's it. And if we get a vision of that invitation to join him in his kingdom work, but also to say, the one who we love so much has entrusted us to be part of faithfully stewarding the expression of the church in our place, it will all feel so worth it when we are with the Lord in the new heavens, the new earth. I don't know how we will reflect on or talk about what we experienced here in our life, but it will matter.
Mm-hmm.
It's not evaporating. It's going to really matter. It's going to matter, I think, more than we think. It will all feel worth it. I'm certain of it. That somehow the great redemptive work he'll do will make sense of all of the sacrifice, all of the pain, all of the discomfort, all of the questioning, all of the uncertainty, and we will surely say it's worth it. Yeah.
Right and good, and yes and amen. Thanks, Jason.